Eli Brennan had spent 3 years perfecting the art of being forgettable, which was harder than it sounded on a colony of 2,000 people where everyone knew everyone's business. But Halcyon Ridge was the kind of place where people came specifically to be forgotten: failed prospectors, ex-military with dishonorable discharges, colonists who'd burned bridges on more civilized worlds. Nobody asked about your past because they didn't want you asking about theirs. Eli fit right in. He worked maintenance on the atmospheric processors that kept the settlement breathing, lived alone in a prefab habitat at the colony's edge where the recycled air tasted like metal and dust, and had successfully avoided meaningful human connection since arriving. It was exactly the life he'd designed after leaving Earth, after the disaster, after realizing that being good at saving people didn't matter when you couldn't save enough of them. The colony itself clung to a rocky plateau on a world officially designated HCR7, but called Halcyon by people with a sense of irony, because there was nothing peaceful about a mining settlement where the wind never stopped and the sun set in shades of rust. Beyond human space, the galaxy was vast and crowded with species older and more established than humanity. The Kelthara were one of them, a warrior culture that had been exploring space when Earth was still figuring out agriculture, known for their combat prowess, their strict codes of honor, and the fact that their elite fighters were legends told in bars across 100 worlds. Eli knew about them the way everyone did, through news feeds, diplomatic reports, and the occasional story from merchants who'd seen their ships. He'd never expected to meet one, never wanted to, really. His interaction with aliens was limited to the few off-world traders who passed through Halcyon buying ore and selling supplies, and he preferred it that way. So when he came home from a double shift fixing pressure seals in Sector 7 and found someone waiting outside his habitat, his first thought was that colony security had finally noticed he'd been siphoning extra power for his water heater. His second thought, when he got close enough to actually see who was waiting, was that he'd walked into the wrong housing block and was about to embarrass himself. Because the woman standing at his door was Kelthara, unmistakable from the ears that swept back from her skull in elegant curves, the silver markings that traced her cheekbones like war paint, the way she stood with the kind of posture that came from lifelong combat training. She was also, objectively, stunning in ways that made Eli's brain stutter. Tall, powerfully built, wearing armor that looked ceremonial and functional simultaneously, etched with glyphs he couldn't read. Her hair was dark, braided in complex patterns, and her eyes were amber, bright, intense, fixed on his door like it held answers to questions he didn't understand. Eli stopped walking, considered turning around and pretending he lived somewhere else, decided that was cowardly and probably wouldn't work since she was clearly waiting for someone, and he was the only person who lived in this habitat. He approached slowly, hands visible, trying to project non-threatening maintenance worker rather than anything that might require a warrior's attention. "Can I help you?" he asked, proud that his voice came out steady. She turned, and those amber eyes locked onto him with recognition that made absolutely no sense because Eli had never seen her before in his life. He would have remembered. People didn't forget meeting Kelthara warriors, especially not ones who looked like they could fight through a battalion before breakfast. "Eli Brennan," she said, and his name in her voice sounded significant, weighted with meaning he couldn't parse. Her accent was there but controlled, each word carefully pronounced. "I have found you at last." Eli's mind raced through possibilities. Mistaken identity, administrative error, someone using his name for illegal activities he'd have to report to colonial security. "I think you have the wrong person," he tried. "I'm just maintenance. I fix atmospheric processors, very boring, definitely not anyone worth finding." She smiled slightly, and it transformed her face from intimidating to something more complicated. "You are exactly who I seek. May I enter? We have much to discuss, and I would prefer privacy for this conversation." Every instinct Eli had developed over 3 years of careful isolation screamed at him to refuse, to send her away, to maintain the boundaries that kept his life small and manageable. But she was looking at him with something that might have been hope or relief or determination, and turning away a Kelthara warrior who'd specifically sought him out seemed like a good way to create exactly the kind of situation he was trying to avoid. "Sure," he heard himself say, unlocking the door, "but I really think you have the wrong Eli Brennan. It's not that uncommon a name." "There is no mistake," she said, following him inside. "I have been searching for you for 4 years." The habitat was small, living area, sleep alcove, basic kitchen, bathroom that barely qualified. Eli hadn't bothered decorating because decoration implied permanence and permanence implied he planned to stay, and staying implied he'd stopped running. The space was cluttered with repair manuals, tools, empty meal containers, the evidence of someone who lived alone and didn't expect visitors. The Kelthara warrior looked around with an expression Eli couldn't read, then turned back to him with that same intensity. "My name is Kyra Velsharan," she said formally. "First Blade of House Velsharan, champion of 7 territorial wars, ranked among the most skilled warriors in Kelthara history." She paused. "And I owe you my life." Eli blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" "4 years ago, on Earth, in the undercity of the megaplex where you worked emergency response, there was an industrial accident, a facility collapse that trapped workers. You entered the structure despite the danger and pulled survivors to safety." Her voice carried the cadence of someone reciting important history. "One of those survivors was me. You saved my life, Eli Brennan. And by the sacred laws of my people, that debt must be repaid." Memory surfaced slowly, not because it wasn't there, but because Eli had spent years trying not to think about that day, about that disaster, about the people he'd saved and the ones he hadn't. The undercity collapse, illegal workers trapped in substandard conditions. Protocol said wait for hazmat clearance. Eli hadn't waited. He'd gone in with a respirator and a harness and pulled out everyone he could reach, one after another, until the structure groaned and someone dragged him out before the final collapse. He remembered faces in flashes, terrified, injured, covered in dust. He'd gotten them to medical services and moved on because that was the job, because there were always more emergencies, because you didn't dwell on the saves when you were still thinking about the losses. "I don't remember you specifically," Eli admitted. "There were a lot of people that day. You were just—" He stopped. "You were unconscious, weren't you? Woman, mid-20s, bleeding from a head wound, trapped under debris." "Yes." Kyra's voice softened slightly. "I was conducting covert diplomatic work on Earth when the collapse was triggered deliberately to eliminate me. I accepted my death as honorable. And then you appeared through the smoke and refused to let me die." Eli sat down slowly on the edge of his sleeping platform because his legs felt unsteady. "You're saying I accidentally saved a Kelthara diplomat during a disaster I barely remember, and you've been looking for me ever since." "Not a diplomat, a warrior assigned to investigate smuggling operations between our species. And yes." She remained standing, formal, like she was delivering a military report. "By Kelthara sacred law, when someone saves your life at risk to their own, a blood debt is created. It cannot be discharged through payment or service, only through binding. The savior becomes family or consort, because a life given must be answered with life shared." The words hung in the small habitat like something with physical weight. Eli tried to process them, tried to find the angle that made them make sense, tried to figure out if this was some kind of elaborate misunderstanding. "So you came here to, what, adopt me?" "I came to claim you as consort," Kyra said clearly. "If you will accept, I offer you my hand, my strength, my allegiance. By law and custom, by honor and debt, I bind myself to you, Eli Brennan." Eli laughed, couldn't help it, because the situation was absurd, because he was a washed-up responder living in exile on a mining colony, and she was clearly someone important, because this had to be a cultural miscommunication that could be cleared up with proper translation. But Kyra didn't laugh, she didn't smile. She looked at him with absolute seriousness, amber eyes steady, and he realized she meant every word. "You're serious," he said slowly. "Completely." Eli ran a hand through his hair, which probably needed washing. "I appreciate the offer, but I was just doing my job. You don't owe me anything. Definitely don't owe me marriage or consortship or whatever this is. We can just call it even, and you can go back to being a champion warrior, and I'll go back to fixing atmospheric processors." Something flickered across Kyra's expression. Not offense exactly, but something close. Refusing a blood debt offering is grave insult in Kelthara culture. It suggests the savior considers the saved unworthy of obligation. I'm not saying you're unworthy. I'm saying this is disproportionate. I pulled you out of a collapsing building. That doesn't mean you have to bind yourself to me for life. By my people's law, it does. She moved closer, and Eli was suddenly very aware of how much taller she was, how her armor caught the habitat's dim lighting, how her presence filled the small space. "I understand this is unexpected. I understand you have no context for our customs, but the debt exists regardless of your knowledge or acceptance. If you refuse, I am shamed. My house is shamed. And diplomatic relations between our species suffer, because it appears humans save lives only to reject the honor of those they save." Eli opened his mouth to argue, to point out how insane this sounded, to explain that he couldn't possibly be what she needed in a consort, because he was barely holding his own life together. But before he could speak, his communicator started chirping urgently, multiple alerts cascading through the colony's network, priority messages flagged with security codes he'd never seen before. He pulled up the display and felt his stomach drop. Alert: unauthorized Kelthara vessel detected in orbital approach. Colonial security requests all residents remain in habitats pending identification. Urgent. Human Diplomatic Corps requesting immediate contact with Eli Brennan, Habitat 7 Delta. Respond immediately. Breaking. Unconfirmed reports of Kelthara first blade on Halcyon Ridge. Governor Chen has declared informational lockdown until situation assessed. Eli looked from the messages to Kyra, who had the grace to look slightly apologetic. "Your arrival," he said carefully, "is apparently causing some concern." "I filed proper diplomatic paperwork with human authorities," Kyra replied. "But my rank and the purpose of my visit likely triggered security protocols. This was expected." "Expected?" Eli's voice climbed slightly. "You expected to cause an interstellar incident by showing up at my door." "I expected political complications. The blood debt supersedes politics." She met his eyes steadily. "But you should know that my presence here will attract attention. From both our governments, from rival Kelthara houses who oppose binding with humans, from those who would prefer the debt remain unfulfilled. If you accept my offer, your life will change significantly. If you refuse," she paused, "your life will also change, though differently." The communicator kept chirping. Through the habitat's small window, Eli could see lights moving in the colony. Security vehicles, probably, responding to whatever alert had just turned his quiet evening into chaos. And standing in his cluttered living space was the most attractive and terrifying woman he'd ever met, telling him she wanted to bind herself to him because he'd done his job 4 years ago, and apparently that created magical life debts in alien cultures. Eli sat there, watching his carefully constructed isolation crumble in real time, and wondered if there was any possible response that wouldn't end with his life getting significantly more complicated. "Okay," he said finally. "Before my communicator explodes or colonial security breaks down my door, can you explain exactly what accepting or refusing actually means? Specifically, in terms that a maintenance worker with no diplomatic training can understand." Kyra nodded, and something in her expression suggested she'd been hoping he'd ask. She sat down across from him, suddenly less warrior and more person, and began to explain the blood debt and everything it entailed. Outside, the colony descended into controlled chaos. Inside, two people from different worlds tried to figure out if a 4-year-old rescue could become the foundation for something neither of them had expected. And Eli, listening to her speak, realized that forgetting was about to get a lot harder. The Colonial Administration Building was not designed to handle diplomatic crises, which became immediately obvious when Eli arrived to find 3 separate groups of people, all trying to shout at each other in the lobby. Colonial Administrator Chen, a hard woman in her 60s who'd run Halcyon Ridge for 15 years, stood behind a makeshift security perimeter looking like she regretted every life choice that had led her here. A human diplomatic team had arrived via emergency shuttle and were arguing with local security about jurisdiction. And a group of Kelthara delegates, Eli counted 5, all wearing formal robes and carrying themselves with warrior discipline, were arranged in what looked like a defensive formation near the entrance. Kyra walked beside Eli with the calm of someone who'd caused this exact situation before and knew how it would play out. She'd insisted on accompanying him, arguing that her presence was required for any discussion of the blood debt. Eli hadn't argued, partly because she was right, mostly because having her nearby felt safer than facing this alone. Administrator Chen spotted them, and her expression cycled through relief, anger, and resignation. "Lieutenant Brennan," she called over the chaos, using his old rank from Earth, "we need to talk, now." They were ushered into a conference room that smelled like recycled air and stress. The diplomatic team consisted of 3 humans. Ambassador Akafor, a career diplomat who looked exhausted, Commander Yates from Fleet Intelligence, who looked suspicious, and a cultural liaison named Rivera who kept taking notes. The Kelthara delegation included an elder named Sevrak Thon who spoke for the group, and several younger warriors who watched Kyra with expressions ranging from respect to disapproval. Everyone sat. Everyone stared at Eli. "So," Administrator Chen began, voice tight with control, "would someone like to explain why a Kelthara First Blade has appeared on my colony claiming blood debt with one of my maintenance workers?" "He is not merely a maintenance worker," Kyra said before Eli could respond. "He is Eli Brennan, savior and honor-bound, to whom I owe life debt under sacred law." Ambassador Akafor leaned forward with the expression of someone delivering very bad news. "Mr. Brennan, are you aware that Kyra Velsharan is not just any warrior? She's ranked among the most skilled combatants in Kelthara history, connected to one of their most powerful noble houses, and politically significant enough that her personal choices affect interspecies relations." "I'm getting that impression, yes," Eli replied. "And you're aware that she's claiming you as consort under their blood debt laws." She mentioned that. "And you understand this is creating a massive diplomatic incident because if you accept, we're essentially binding a human civilian to Kelthara nobility, which sets precedents about legal jurisdiction, cultural obligations, and the political status of humans in their society." Eli looked at Kyra, who remained perfectly composed despite being discussed like a problem to solve. "I'm starting to understand that, yeah." Commander Yates cut in, voice sharp. "What we need to understand is your relationship with the First Blade. How did you come to save her life? Were you working with Kelthara intelligence? Was this a planned operation?" "I was doing my job," Eli said flatly. 4 years ago on Earth there was an industrial accident in the Undercity. I was emergency response. I went in and pulled out survivors. One of them happened to be her. I didn't know she was Kelthara, didn't know she was nobility, didn't know I was creating some kind of magical life debt. I was just trying to stop people from dying." "He risked his life," Kyra added quietly. "The structure was collapsing. Protocol required waiting for safety clearance. He ignored protocol and entered anyway. Without his intervention, I would have died." Sevrak Thon, the Kelthara elder, spoke for the first time. His voice was deep, resonant, carrying weight. The blood debt is clear under our law. Life given for life saved. The first blade is within her rights to claim the savior as consort. This is not negotiable. Everything is negotiable, Ambassador Okafor countered. Mr. Brennan was acting as a human emergency responder under Earth jurisdiction. He had no knowledge of Kelthara law or cultural obligations. You cannot bind someone to alien legal codes without their informed consent. The law does not require informed consent, Sevrak replied. It requires the act itself, life risked for life saved. The savior's knowledge is irrelevant. The debt exists. The argument escalated from there. Humans arguing about autonomy and jurisdiction. Kelthara arguing about sacred tradition and legal precedent. Everyone talking over each other while Eli sat in the middle wondering how pulling someone from a collapsing building had turned into interstellar politics. Kyra remained silent beside him, but he could see tension in her shoulders, the way her hands gripped the edge of the table. Finally, Administrator Chen slammed her hand down hard enough to make everyone stop. Enough. Here's what's going to happen. Mr. Brennan has 72 hours to decide whether to accept or refuse the blood debt. During that time, both governments will prepare position statements and will convene a formal hearing to address the legal complications. Nobody does anything dramatic, nobody makes unilateral decisions, and definitely nobody starts a war over marriage customs. Understood. Binding customs, Kyra corrected quietly. Marriage is your term. We call it soul binding. Whatever you call it, we're hitting pause until everyone calms down, Chen said firmly. She looked at Eli. You're free to go. I suggest you think carefully about what you want because whatever you decide is going to affect more than just your life. The meeting dissolved into logistics. Eli stood to leave, feeling overwhelmed and exhausted. Kyra followed him out into the corridor, where they could hear the diplomatic teams already resuming their arguments through the closed door. I'm sorry, she said after a moment. I knew my arrival would cause complications, but I underestimated the extent. It's not your fault, Eli replied. You're following your laws, they're following theirs. I'm just the guy who didn't know pulling someone from a disaster would result in this. They walked in silence through the colony's corridors, heading back toward his habitat. The settlement had returned to something like normal, people going about their work, trying to ignore the diplomatic circus that had descended on their quiet mining outpost. But Eli could feel the stares, hear the whispers. Everyone knew who he was now. His carefully constructed anonymity was gone. Can I ask you something? He said as they approached his habitat. Of course. Why does it have to be consort? You said the debt could be discharged through family binding. Couldn't you just, I don't know, adopt me or make me an honorary sibling or something that doesn't involve soul binding? Kyra was quiet for several steps. The nature of the bond depends on the nature of the debt. You risked your life for mine without obligation, without knowing me, without expectation of reward. That creates the deepest level of debt, which can only be answered with the deepest level of binding. Family bonds are for saving kin or allies. Soul binding is for saving strangers who become something more through the act of salvation. That's really complicated. All meaningful things are, she said softly. They reached his habitat and stopped outside. The evening was settling over Halcyon Ridge, the rust-colored sky fading to deep purple. Through the colony's atmospheric dome, stars were beginning to appear distant, indifferent to human or Kelthara problems. I need time to think, Eli said finally. I know, I will respect whatever decision you make. Kyra met his eyes. But you should know something before you decide. I didn't come here only because of duty or law. I came because I've thought about you every day for 4 years. About the man who appeared through smoke and chaos and told me I was going to be fine, that he had me, that I just needed to hold on. You were the first person in my warrior's life who protected me instead of expecting me to protect them. The debt is real, Eli Brennan, But so is my gratitude. So is my desire to know the person who saved me. She turned and walked away before he could respond, moving with that perfect warrior's grace toward wherever the Kelthara delegation had set up temporary quarters. Eli watched her go, then went inside his habitat and sat in the dark, trying to figure out how to make a decision that would change everything no matter what he chose. His communicator chimed. A message from Administrator Chen. Heads up, news feeds have the story. You're going to be famous by morning. Sorry. Eli pulled up the feeds and found his face plastered across multiple networks. Human Rescuer CLAIMED by Kelthara Warrior, Blood Debt or Political Stunt. Maintenance Worker BECOMES Center of INTERSPCIES Crisis. Who is Eli BRNNAN, and why does the Galaxy's most attractive warrior want HIM? That last headline made him laugh, which felt inappropriate but also necessary. He was still scrolling through increasingly dramatic coverage when his habitat lost power completely. Not flickering, full blackout, the kind that didn't happen unless someone deliberately cut main distribution. Eli stood slowly in the darkness, his emergency response training kicking in before conscious thought. Power failures in a domed colony were serious. Life support ran on independent systems, but lighting, heating, communications, all of that died without main power. Then he heard the sound of his door being forced open. Eli moved instinctively, grabbing the maintenance multi-tool from his belt, not a weapon, but better than nothing, and positioning himself behind the door frame. Two figures entered, backlit by emergency lighting from the corridor. They wore environment suits with opaque faceplates, moved with coordinated precision, and one of them was carrying something that looked very much like a weapon. Eli Brennan, one of them said, voice distorted through the suit speaker. You need to come with us, quietly. I really don't think I do, Eli replied, heart hammering. The figure with the weapon raised it. This isn't a request. What happened next occurred in seconds that felt like hours. The window of Eli's habitat exploded inward, not shattered, deliberately breached, and Kyra came through like a force of nature, armor gleaming even in darkness, moving with speed that didn't seem possible for someone her size. She hit the first intruder with a strike that sent them crashing into the wall hard enough to crack the prefab material. The second turned toward her, weapon coming up, and she disarmed them with a move Eli couldn't follow, breaking their wrist in the process if the scream was any indication. The whole confrontation lasted maybe 10 seconds. When it was over, both intruders were on the ground, disarmed and restrained, and Kyra was standing between them and Eli like a living barrier. Are you injured? She asked without turning around. No, Eli managed. I'm what just happened. Assassination attempt, poorly executed but serious. She pulled the faceplate off one of the intruders, revealing a Kelthara warrior, young, expression twisted with pain and something that might have been shame. Sevrak will be disappointed. He was supposed to be controlling the traditionalist faction. Colony security arrived seconds later, flooding the habitat with emergency lighting and armed personnel. Administrator Chen pushed through the crowd, took one look at the scene, and her expression suggested she was seriously considering retirement. Lieutenant Brennan, are you hurt? I'm fine, Eli gestured at Kyra. She stopped them. Of course she did, Chen muttered. She turned to the security team. Take these two into custody, full medical scan, then interrogation. I want to know who sent them and what the plan was. She looked back at Eli. You can't stay here. It's not secure anymore. I will ensure his safety, Kyra said firmly. He stays with me. That's not non-negotiable, Administrator. He is under my protection now. Anyone who wishes to harm him must go through me. Kyra's voice carried absolute certainty, and I promise you no one will. Chen looked like she wanted to argue, but the broken wall and unconscious assailants suggested arguing with Kyra was unlikely to be productive. Fine. But this happens in secure quarters with colony security oversight. and we're having a very serious conversation about appropriate use of force in residential sectors. The next hour was chaos. Statements to security, medical checks, the intruders being hauled away while shouting about tradition and honor, and how humans were corrupting Kelthara sacred law. The power came back on, revealing the full extent of damage to Eli's habitat. The window was destroyed. One wall had structural cracks, and his few possessions were scattered across the floor. "I'm sorry about your home," Kyra said quietly as they surveyed the damage. "It's just a habitat," Eli replied. "I'm more concerned about people trying to kill me." "Commander Thex Riven," she said, voice tight with controlled anger. "A traditionalist who opposes any binding between Kelthara and humans. He likely ordered the attempt to nullify the debt before you could accept. If you die, the obligation disappears and I remain unbound." She looked at him. "I should have anticipated this. Should have provided security immediately. I failed to protect you. You literally crashed through my window and stopped them in about 5 seconds. I think you protected me pretty effectively. I should have prevented the attempt entirely." She turned away, and Eli saw something he hadn't expected, guilt, sharp and genuine, in the set of her shoulders. "You are in danger because of me. Because I claimed you, because I created a political target. Perhaps the diplomatic team is right. Perhaps you should refuse the bond and return to your quiet life." Eli looked at the wreckage of his habitat, at the woman who'd come through a window to save him, at the complexity that had exploded into his carefully controlled existence. He thought about 3 years of isolation, of living small, of choosing safety over everything because taking risks meant people got hurt. He thought about the disaster on Earth, about the people he'd saved and the ones he hadn't, about how he'd run to the edge of space to escape the weight of both. "You know what's funny?" he said. "I came here to hide, came here to be forgettable because on Earth I was emergency response and I was good at it, but I wasn't good enough. There was a disaster, the same one where I pulled you out and I saved a lot of people, but not all of them, not enough. And the ones I couldn't reach, they stayed with me. Every face, every voice, every person I was too slow or too late to save. So I came here to be alone with that failure, to work maintenance where the only thing at risk was machinery." Kyra turned back to him, listening with complete attention. "But you found me anyway," Eli continued. "Tracked me across space because I saved your life, and now you're offering to bind yourself to me because your people believe life debts matter. And yeah, people are trying to kill me because of it. Yeah, it's complicated and political and way beyond anything I understand. But you know what the alternative is. Going back to being alone, to living small, to running from connection because connection means risk." He met her amber eyes. "I spent 3 years doing that. I'm tired of it." "You're saying you want to accept the bond," Kyra said carefully. "I'm saying I don't want to refuse it because I'm scared. If I'm going to make this decision, I want it to be because I actually decided, not because I ran away again." He managed a smile that felt shaky. "Also, you crashed through my window to save me. Feels like the least I can do is give this soul-binding thing a fair shot." Kyra stared at him for a long moment. Then slowly, something changed in her expression, walls coming down, the warrior mask falling away to show the person beneath. "You're certain, even knowing the danger, the political complications, the fact that you'll be bound to someone you barely know?" "I'm not certain about anything except that I'm done running," Eli replied. "So yeah, let's do this. Let's see if a 4-year-old rescue can become something worth keeping." She smiled then, really smiled, not the warrior's mask but genuine warmth and relief, and something that might have been hope. "Then I will protect you, Eli Brennan. From traditionalists, from political enemies, from anyone who thinks they can harm what is mine. You saved me once. Now I save you. That is what consorts do. Also apparently they crash through windows," Eli added. "Only when necessary," Kyra replied, and her smile widened. "Usually we use doors." The binding ceremony was scheduled for 3 days later. which was apparently rushing things by Kelthara standards, but everyone agreed that waiting longer just gave assassins more opportunities. Eli spent those 3 days learning more about Kelthara culture than he'd ever imagined needing to know. The formal vows he'd need to speak, the ritual significance of different gestures, the social structure he was binding himself into. Kyra was patient, teaching him pronunciation and context, explaining that the ceremony itself was less about romance and more about formal recognition of obligation fulfilled. Kelthara don't marry for love initially, she explained one evening as they reviewed ceremony protocols in the secure quarters colony security had assigned them. We bind for duty, for alliance, for honor. Love, if it comes, develops after the binding. It's considered more stable that way, building affection on the foundation of commitment rather than the reverse. That's very practical and also kind of sad, Eli observed. Is it? Your people bind for emotion and then struggle when emotion fades. We bind for structure and then discover emotion within it. Different approaches to the same goal. Which is? Not being alone, Kyra said softly. Finding someone who stands beside you when everything else fails. They'd fallen into an easy rhythm over the past days. Formal lessons transitioning into actual conversation. Kyra asking about Earth and human culture. Eli asking about Kelthara history and the wars she'd fought. He learned she was 34 by human years, had been training as a warrior since. Why did you become a warrior? He asked one night. Because I was good at it, she replied, and because in Kelthara culture excellence demands pursuit. To have a gift and not develop it is considered wasteful. She paused. But also because warriors protect people. I like that purpose, being the one who stands between danger and those who cannot fight. That's why I became a responder, Eli admitted. Same reason, wanting to be the one who helps. Then we are similar in the ways that matter, Kyra said, and something in her voice made him look up to find her watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. I am glad the debt brought me to you, Eli Brennan. Even with the complications. The ceremony itself was held in the colony's largest assembly hall, hastily converted into something that could accommodate both Kelthara tradition and human witnesses. Both governments sent delegations, humans led by Ambassador Akafar, Kelthara led by Sevrak Thon and including warriors from multiple houses. Commander Thex, Riven had been arrested for ordering the assassination attempt, but his faction still sent representatives to witness an object if they found grounds. Eli wore formal clothes borrowed from colony administration, because he didn't own anything remotely ceremonial. Kyra wore full warrior regalia, armor polished to mirror brightness, ceremonial blades at her hips, her hair braided in patterns that apparently signified she was entering a soul binding of highest honor. She looked stunning and intimidating and completely out of his league, and Eli tried not to think about how many people were watching him bind himself to someone who could probably conquer small planets before breakfast. The ceremony began with Sevrak Thon speaking in formal Kelthara, explaining the blood debt and its significance. Then it was Eli's turn to speak the acceptance vows, words he'd memorized phonetically, promising partnership and mutual protection, acknowledging the debt and his willingness to answer it through binding. His pronunciation was probably terrible, but he meant every word. Kyra responded with the traditional binding vows, offering her strength and allegiance, claiming him formally as consort under the laws of her people. Her voice was steady, clear, carrying through the assembly hall with absolute certainty. Then came the part Kyra had warned him about, the blade offering. She removed one of the ceremonial weapons from her belt, a beautiful piece of craftsmanship that looked both decorative and deadly, and held it horizontally between them. In Kelthara tradition, she said in English for the benefit of human witnesses, a warrior's blade represents their honor, who they are beneath armor and title. To offer your blade to your consort is to trust them with your true self, without pretense or protection. She looked at him steadily. Eli Brennan, I offer you my blade. Will you keep it safe? Eli took it carefully, feeling the weight of the weapon and the symbolism. "I will," he said, hoping that was the right response. Kyra smiled. Then she did something he hadn't expected. She removed her helmet, the final piece of armor, and set it aside. In Kelthara culture, Sevrak had explained, removing your helmet before your consort symbolized removing your last defense, choosing vulnerability over protection. "I trust you with my honor," she said quietly just for him, "with who I am when the warrior mask comes off." "I'll do my best not to break it," Eli replied, and she actually laughed. Sevrak declared the binding complete under Kelthara law. Ambassador Akafar added formal recognition from human authorities. The assembly responded with acknowledgement, some enthusiastic, some grudging, all of it witnessed and recorded and official. It was done. Eli stood there holding a ceremonial blade, bound to a woman he'd known for less than a week, surrounded by diplomats and warriors and people still debating whether this was precedent-setting unity or catastrophic mistake. And somehow it felt right, felt like choosing something instead of running from it. Kyra stepped closer, took his free hand in hers. "How do you feel?" she asked quietly. "Terrified and hopeful and completely out of my depth," Eli admitted. "Also like I just made a decision I can't take back." "Kelthara bindings are permanent," she confirmed. "But I will spend my life ensuring you do not regret this choice." "That's a lot of pressure." "That is partnership." The reception afterward was mercifully brief. Formal congratulations, statements for record, messages from both governments acknowledging the binding and hoping it represented positive relations between species. Commander Thex Riven's representatives left immediately, which everyone agreed was probably for the best. The human delegation looked cautiously optimistic that this wouldn't explode into full diplomatic crisis. The Kelthara seemed divided between those who thought Kyra had honored ancient tradition and those who thought she'd made a terrible mistake binding herself to a human. Finally, they were released back to their quarters, now officially shared, with Eli's few possessions moved from his destroyed habitat. Kyra removed her formal armor piece by piece, setting each component aside with careful precision, until she stood in the lighter underlayer that was practical rather than ceremonial. "So," Eli said, setting her blade carefully on a table because it seemed like the kind of thing you didn't just drop on the floor, "we're soul-bound. What happens now?" "Now we figure out how to make this work," Kyra replied. "I am assigned to diplomatic duties that will require traveling to Kelthara homeworld and various human colonies. You are bound to me, which means you travel with me. Your life is no longer here. I figured that part out. And we learn about each other. Build the partnership that the ceremony recognized but doesn't create automatically." She sat on the edge of the sleeping platform, and for the first time since he'd met her, looked uncertain. "I have been a warrior my entire life, Eli. I know combat and duty and honor. I do not know how to be a consort, how to share space with someone, how to—" She stopped. "How to be vulnerable without it being weakness." Eli sat beside her, careful to maintain respectful distance. "I spent 3 years avoiding exactly that. Avoiding vulnerability, avoiding connection, avoiding anything that might hurt if I failed. So I'm not exactly an expert either." "Then we learn together," Kyra said. "No expectations except that we try." "That sounds familiar," Eli replied, remembering saying almost the same thing days ago. "I can work with that." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars through the quarter's viewport. Halcyon Ridge continued its orbit, neutral ground where species met and tried to understand each other. Inside, 2 unlikely consorts, bound by ancient law and recent choice, began the work of figuring out what their binding actually meant beyond ceremony and politics. "Hey, Kyra," Eli said after a while. "Yes." "Thank you for crashing through my window." She turned to look at him, confusion and amusement mixing in her expression. "You're thanking me for property destruction. I'm thanking you for caring enough about my safety to crash through a window. For protecting me even though we barely knew each other. for choosing to honor a debt you could have probably gotten out of if you'd really wanted to. He smiled, for finding me in the first place. Kyra was quiet for a moment, then, "You saved my life when you had no reason to care whether I lived or died. Protecting you is the least I can do." She paused. "But also I wanted to. That matters too." "Yeah," Eli agreed, "it does." Outside, the galaxy continued its vast, indifferent rotation, full of species and politics and complications neither of them could control. But inside, in quarters that smelled like new beginnings and shared